we're probably already in World War III, to be honest. World War III is not going to look like World War II. We were talking about this a little bit earlier with the idea of proxy wars.
Mm-hmm.
Proxy wars are a tool that superpowers use to fight against each other without expending their own human lives. We've been in proxy wars since 2012. Syria, Yemen, Libya, we're all proxy wars. And those are just the major proxy wars. We're not even talking about some of the wars that you've seen in Thailand, in Myanmar, conflicts that have happened all across Latin America, coups in Africa. They're all smaller, less newsworthy proxy wars, and Americans are totally blind to it. In many ways, I would argue that we're already in the beginning phases of World War III. And World War III looks like proxy war between the world's largest economies, which those economies are starting to band together, right? World War II was defined by Axis and allies. Remember that? You had Italy and Germany, Nazi Germany, and Japan all working together with some other countries. And then you had the UK and the Americans and the Australians all working together with countries like Russia and China as the allied powers. We're already seeing that happen now. You're seeing it in the UN. You're seeing it with NATO. You see Russia, China, Iran, North Korea coming closer and closer together, pulling Turkey into their own sphere of influence. You see Poland, Germany, the UK, the United States, Canada, all pulling together, right? And you see the countries, the world itself dividing along these axis and allied powers again. That's, to me, signs that the world is already preparing for a long-term engagement, a long-term war. The war just won't look like nuclear weapons and bombers taking over cities. It's going to look like a line of third world countries that everybody's going to fight over. And there's going to be devastation in these third world countries that are resource-rich countries, mineral-rich countries, strategically important countries. But the majority of the population will stay calm because they won't feel like they're at war. World War I, World War II, you had mass panic, you had hysteria. People were terrified all the time. Children hiding under desks because there was a war going on, and everybody could use that word. We've grown. Governments have grown much smarter since then. They don't want people talking about war. They want people worried about nuclear weapons because that makes you support your own government. But as soon as you're at war, we learned in Vietnam, the people can turn against their government. No government wants that.
Well, I agree with you 100%. However, Zelenskyy is on the record saying America's going to have to send their sons and daughters over here to fight and die alongside with us. And there's been rumors, and I'm sure they're just rumors. I don't think there's any validity to them yet, but talking about a draft. This could escalate, and we are talking about all these different, look at Afghanistan. China was there to negotiate with Taliban before we were even pulled out. And I believe that was all over lithium, but what's to say that we don't send our own guys again into these third world countries that are rich in materials and
strategic importance.
Yes.
Yeah. There's always a probability. There's always a possibility. Always. I just think the probability is low. Let's be frank when we talk about President Zelenskyy. All right? President Zelenskyy is a president of a third world country that is at war with Russia. Has he gone down and secured his place in history as a heroic president? I would say yes. But he was an actor before he was elected by a third world population to become the leader of their country. And the show that he's famous for was a show where basically he was talking about Russian corruption in Ukraine. For all we know, he could still just be playing the same role that he was playing when he was an actor. He has no statesman chops. He has no background in understanding diplomacy or understanding politics. Over the last year, there have been at least a half a dozen instances where he has spoken out of turn and then been corrected. Do you remember when he said that he would never negotiate with Putin? Do you remember that?
I do.
That was like, what, 8 months ago, 6 months ago? And then he got a phone call from President Biden that said something along the lines of, you can't draw a red line like that. And then he changed his position, right? You saw him talk about how the war would never stop until Ukraine had regained all of its territorial integrity back as far as 1999. And then he had to walk that back, right? The guy is a very good populist leader. He's very good at getting people excited, and he's very good at making headlines. And that's good, because that's what Ukraine needs. But he's not a statesman, right? He is not an experienced wartime leader in terms of actually knowing how to negotiate and reduce conflict. That's not what he's good at. He has to constantly get redirected by the United States because we are the primary people funding his war, right? Funding his defense. So he's constantly having to renavigate us. So 4 days ago or earlier this week, he made some comment about how if China gives lethal aid to Russia, the whole world is going to war. He doesn't know what the hell he's talking about.
Yeah.
Right? President Obama said that chemical weapons in Syria were going to be a red line. And then Assad used chemical weapons in Syria, and nothing happened. Mm-hmm. Right? One of the biggest blunders of the Obama administration. That was an American president committing American resources to a conflict. So what right does President Zelenskyy have to commit world resources to a conflict that only involves him and Russia right now? It's just not likely.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? And for me, as an American watching this, it makes me very upset. It makes me very frustrated to see how Zelenskyy uses his public profile to continue to incite violence and continue to incite aggression. Yes, I understand Russia's doing the same thing. But I remember being a 10-year-old kid and my parents teaching me that you have to be the bigger man to win a conflict, right? So if he just resorts to the same kind of populist propaganda that the Russians use to incite their own people to violence, who's actually winning? And this is what's mind-boggling to me. The only country to propose a peace plan was China. China proposed a peace plan that both Zelenskyy and Putin actually publicly acknowledged and took the time to read and listen to. Now, as of today, they haven't agreed to any peace plan, but it's ridiculous that the one country who has thought up the idea of taking a leadership role in negotiating a ceasefire has been China. I think Turkey may have tried something early on, but it wasn't taken seriously by either side. Mm-hmm. But here, China is essentially the world leader right now in negotiating peace in Europe. That's mind-boggling.
What does that look like for us?
Dude, that's bad in so many ways. First of all, for China to even propose a peace plan means that they understand they have leverage over both parties. You never propose a peace plan unless you have something to gain from the peace. China knows that they're one of the primary sources for funding Russia. So they can definitely lean into Putin and say, hey, we're going to give you an out that saves face. We're going to protect your ego and protect your country by giving you a ceasefire agreement that benefits Russia. And if you do what we tell you to do, you'll continue to have the benefits of a Chinese partner, right, for the next 20 years. But they can also go to Ukraine and say, Ukraine, you do what we tell you to do because we have a collar, a leash on Russia. And we'll be able to protect and enforce any agreement they make. And because we bring peace to Ukraine, you'll give us dibs on rebuilding Ukraine, or you'll give us beneficial treatment in Ukraine in the future, right? So we're going to step in and essentially benefit from all the money and conflict all the money and investment that's come from the United States. Do you remember what happened when we left Afghanistan?
Which part?
every part, right? We left Afghanistan, China stepped in.
Yeah.
They took mineral rights, they supported the Taliban, they started the humanitarian effort.
That infuriates me. How did that happen?
The same way they're setting it up right now in Ukraine, right? The United States.
How was that missed?
Yeah.
Especially with this green energy movement to abandon lithium deposits of that size is just it doesn't. Was it on purpose?
I mean, I subscribe to Hanlon's razor, a logical saying that we're taught at the agency. Never subscribe to conspiracy, that which can be explained with idiocy. That kind of conspiracy, to think that we orchestrated the abandonment of lithium mines to give them to China, that is so complicated that it just makes more logical sense to assume somebody was stupid. Doesn't feel good, but probability-wise, that's the more probable outcome.
But then you have all these ties between China and the Biden administration, and China and Biden's son, and is it that much of a conspiracy?
So we think that these ties are new. And that's why we think they're conspiracies. Stop to think about the fact that China did not participate in the war on terror.
Mm-hmm.
So what were they doing with all their time, money, and attention going back to 2001? They weren't fighting terrorists.
Mm-hmm.
They were building this huge network of resources all around the globe. They were taking advantage of the fact that America was distracted. The other superpower was distracted by the war on terror, right? We essentially got caught with our pants down, right? The whole world ran on the back of Chinese manufacturing.
Mm-hmm.
When you follow the breadcrumbs of Chinese businesses, I mean, it's shell corporation on top of shell corporation on top of shell corporation. Where did they learn that? From us. More Chinese visas were granted for Chinese people to go to American law schools than any other country. And when they finished law school, they didn't become American attorneys. They went back to China to become attorneys for Chinese firms that help negotiate contracts globally that they know they can enforce over the United States. One of the reasons that this chip war, there's a big chip war between the US and China. One of the big reasons that chip war is continuing, and the reasons that Biden has to pass presidential legislation to stop the transfer of chips, is because legally, under existing laws, China has it all nailed down. That's how they took over Hong Kong. They took it over legally first. They've been laying the foundation to legally take over Taiwan for the last 7 years, right? Like, that's how they operate. They operate according to the rule of international law, because then the international courts have no option except to support them. And they can do insane things like beating people in the streets in Hong Kong and not fall under legal ramifications because they've already got the laws all ironed out, right? But going back to your point about, what's it look like if China negotiates peace in Europe? It looks like the United States is a warmonger, and it looks like the United States no longer has a sphere of influence in Europe because the United States couldn't negotiate peace. It took China to negotiate peace. That's what it looks like. It looks like that 2033 timeline just got shortened by about 3 years.
Yeah. We've been talking about if this goes to World War III, and it looks a lot like what it is now, just amplified. However, Putin has threatened nuclear missiles. So are you totally discounting that?
I don't totally discount the use of nuclear weapons. I will say that the probability of a nuclear weapon going off in the United States is extremely small.
Mm-hmm.
The probability of a nuclear weapon going off in a NATO country is extremely small. It doesn't make any sense for Putin to use a nuclear warhead in a country that guarantees war with the United States, that guarantees retaliation with the United States. That doesn't make sense. But it's not nearly so cut and dry, right? People think, again, thanks to the oversimplification of media, we think that Russia's going to launch some nuclear weapon that hits New York. That's not how wars are fought. Wars are fought with covert action and with plausible deniability. So what happens if a small yield nuclear weapon goes off in Kiev that was smuggled there in a briefcase through Belarus? That's a much more likely outcome. Who takes responsibility for that? Who does NATO hold accountable for that?
Yeah.
Right? The only facts, the only evidence you would have are a blast in Kiev, no missile, no source that you know of where it was deployed from, and maybe you can track it back to crossing the border from Belarus, but Belarus isn't at war with Ukraine. Belarus is a proxy for Russia, but you can't hold Putin responsible for what Belarus does. You have to hold Lukashenko responsible for what Belarus does. But who holds him responsible? It's not a NATO country. So does NATO go to war with Belarus? You see how messy that would get? Mm-hmm. That's how this kind of conflict actually happens. You want there to be so much confusion that people can't plan their response. One of the benefits that autocracies have over democracies, China, Russia being autocracies, Syria, Iran being autocracies, is they don't have to worry about bureaucratic gridlock. The United States, on its own, has bureaucratic gridlock all the time. NATO is a conglomerate of bureaucracies. It's a bureaucracy of bureaucracies. So imagine the gridlock that they have to deal with. Part of the reason the United States is the one funding Ukraine is because NATO can't make a decision. They can't make a decision over 6 months, let alone 6 hours, right? At least the president can pass an executive order and everybody moves forward. So autocracies are constantly playing against that democratic weakness of bureaucracy. So a pocket nuke goes off in Kiev, or a pocket nuke goes off in the Donbass region, and it's smuggled through Romania, or it's smuggled through Moldova, or it's smuggled through Belarus. Who's held responsible for that? What's the global response to that? NATO is gridlocked. The United States is putting pressure on NATO to come to a certain conclusion, but NATO doesn't want to come to that conclusion because then they look like they're being bullied by the United States. In the meantime, you still have a nuke that just went off in Ukraine. That is absolutely within the realm of plausibility. But what's the benefit? Unless it's a city like Kiev, unless it takes out the entire presidential core or the entire leadership core, it doesn't really benefit Russia. And that's what Russia, if Russia's going to use a nuke, if they're going to use a nuke overtly or covertly, they want to use it in a way that brings a very specific benefit to them.
So fresh on